Book 5 of the Republic is the moment where we stop searching for the definition of justice and begin struggling with what that definition demands of us. The entire chapter is a stress test of sorts for the entire concept of justice itself and the feasibility of Socrates' ideal city. In it, he's confronted with three waves of challenge to the Callipolis, each with an increasing level of strangeness and an increasing level of intensity. Firstly, you have the concept of women in the guardian class being educated and given the same tasks as men, which was a very radical proposal at the time. Secondly, the dissolution of the family unit and its sublation into a higher political unity, the holding of wives and children in common, it's called in the book. And finally, the question of the feasibility of the city itself, if it can really come into existence, which Socrates answers with the famous concept of the Philosopher King, which was an extremely radical proposal at the time, as we'll talk about later on. And what makes Book 5 fascinating is that it works on two levels at once. It's full of concrete questions on gender, family, what it means to be a philosopher. At the same time, it opens the door to the Proclean metaphysics that we love on this channel so much. Opinion versus knowledge, unity versus fragmentation, and the question of the structure of the soul itself. We're going to be covering both angles of Book 5 here, taking each wave both as an earthly, political concern, and then elevating the arguments to the realm of the incorporeal. And at the end of the video, I'm going to offer a interesting Hermetic Aside that I think you guys will enjoy. So in any event, welcome back to Hermetic Perspective. My name is Jack, and let's get into Book 5 here. We begin with, yet again, an objection from Adeimantus, and he basically says to Socrates, hey, earlier you made this comment about how the women of the guardian class should be educated and given the same tasks as the men. And you also said that the women and children of the guardian class should be held in common among the entire class. At the time, in Book 4, when Socrates first said this, Adeimantus interjected as well. But Socrates kind of brushed it off and said, let's not talk about that right now. Let's not open that can of worms until later. Well, now is later. Now is the time for Socrates to justify this. And that's the first wave which Socrates has to surmount in Book 5. Why does it follow logically, based on the rules of the Callipolis, that the women of the guardian class should be educated and given the same tasks as the men? Adeimantus's interjection here, his disagreement at its core is essentially, if justice constitutes everybody doing their given task according to their nature and not deviating from it, how can we then say that men and women should do the same task in the guardian class when their natures differ? Socrates' answer is essentially to prove that, in fact, men and women do not differ in essential nature. So that's the argument here. So it's important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about this section that Plato is talking specifically about the guardian class here, the rulers of the city, the small subset of elites who govern everybody else. It's easy to kind of mistake this part for a sort of proto-feminist proposal, right? Plato's saying that all men and women in society should be brought up the same, given the same opportunities, same jobs, same education. And, back then that would be a totally crazy proposal, right? To us today, that makes sense, right? That's how society mostly functions now, the way most people think. But back then, that would have been completely out there. So that's not what he's saying. He's talking specifically about the guardian class. And if you read it closely, it ends up being more a elitist proposal than any kind of feminist one. What he's basically saying is that while men and women may differ, the men and women of the guardian class are of a nature that they constitute a higher unity as guardians. Essentially, their nature as guardians, their categorization into the guardian class, supersedes their categorization as men and women. That's what he's really trying to say here. So Plato's point with this is that if the guardian nature takes precedent over the nature of men and women, then the guardians should be brought up in the same way, given the same opportunities, given the same education, regardless of their sex, right? And while this makes good enough sense, it's a bit bare bones, and it doesn't address the core concern that Adeimantus voiced, which was actually proving that they have the same nature. He understands that if they do have the same nature, they should receive the same education, but still hasn't been proven. So we can turn to Proclus here to really understand what needs to be done in order to prove this. And he tells us that in order to prove the unity of nature among men and women, we must prove two things. We have to prove that it is the same in both virtue and in essence. We have to prove that men and women are the same in both in order for their nature to be the same. So if we work off of this framework, which Proclus has set out, there's essentially four positions that you can take. You can say that men and women are different in both virtue and in essence. You can say that they are the same in essence but different in virtue, which Proclus says the followers of Aristotle believe. You can say that they are the same in virtue but different in essence, which he says the Stoics believe. Or you can say that they're the same in both essence and in virtue, which is what Socrates believes. So our task becomes we need to disprove the first three options, and thus the last option will be proven correct, the position of Socrates. Luckily for us, in completing this task, we can kill two birds off with one stone here. If we're able to prove that one specific virtue must follow from one specific essence, and that one essence cannot produce two different virtues, then we'd be able to prove both the followers of Aristotle and the Stoics wrong right out of the gate. So that's what we're going to set out to do first. And Proclus's reasoning here is fairly simple. If we keep with our Platonic understanding of the concept of what a virtue is, which we established back in Book 1, we would say that virtue is the virtue which perfects something's nature. Essentially, virtue is what makes something function as best it can. We talked about how the virtue of the soul is justice back then, and this idea was bolstered in our arguments during Book 4 when we finally came upon the definition of justice. We defined justice as all parts of the soul completing their allotted task according to their nature without deviation, right? So we come to see from this definition that justice certainly is the virtue of the soul. It's what perfects the soul's nature, right? The soul's nature is to complete the task given to the soul. So if all parts of the soul are working in tandem, constituting justice, that is its virtue because it's allowing it to run more effectively, more efficiently. So in other words, the virtue of a thing is what allows it to complete its function in the most efficient and perfect way. So, because of this, the virtue of a thing must match up to its essence, okay? So if the essence of a pruning knife is to prune things, its virtue will be whatever allows it to prune more effectively, right? So it'd probably be sharpness in this case. That's another example from Book 1. But still adds up here. So that virtue of sharpness of the pruning knife follows from its essence. And that essence can't produce any different virtue. Same with the soul. The virtue of the soul can't be anything other than justice. And the virtue of different individual souls, my soul, your soul, someone else's soul, their virtue is all going to be justice because they all have the same essential nature. Someone else's soul isn't going to have a different virtue just because it's a different being, a different entity, So now we can easily say the followers of Aristotle and the Stoics, they must be wrong because you can't have this mismatch between essence and virtue. So we now understand that both must be alike, that virtue must follow from a specific essence. What do we then say to the person who says, okay, that's fine, whatever, you've proven that? That must just mean that men and women differ in both virtue and in essence. And in response to this, Proclus would say that it is a ridiculous assertion on its face. What you're basically saying there is that men and women have zero commonality. They're essentially different species, right? If we're different in both virtue and essence, there's no common ground there. If you were to say that, how could you even categorize men and women in the same category if there's nothing alike about them? So it's pretty much just a ridiculous thing to say. It doesn't make any sense, and we can throw that out right away. So now we're left with only Socrates' position, that men and women are the same in essence and in virtue, and thus they share the same nature. Additionally, to bolster his argument, Proclus says that the variation in intensity or degree of nature, which is the reason that a lot of people insist on a difference between men and women in essential nature, is not in fact an argument for difference, but one which actually strengthens the argument for sameness. So just because men and women may be physically different, well, women may be physically weaker in a lot of cases, that doesn't mean that they're completely different beings, right? If you had a man who can bench press 495 pounds, you have a man who can bench press 135 pounds, you're not going to say that that guy is not a man anymore, that he's not a human being in his essential nature, right? That makes no sense. So why would it be any different for men and women, the question of men and women? The fact that women are pursuing the same tasks as men and can complete the same tasks means that they do have a common nature. And the fact that women may be physically weaker a lot of the time doesn't change that. In fact, the fact that we're measuring it in the same way, they're trying to complete the same tasks, is more a suggestion of sameness than difference. Thus, we've proven the nature of men and women to be the same, and so logically they must be educated the same in the guardian class and allowed to carry out the same tasks, right? Uh, and if we want to bring this up to a higher level here, we can understand that yet again, it's a way for Plato to reduce complexity within the Callipolis, and especially within the guardian class, and of course, following from this, in the soul. The guardian class, which we established last video, is meant to represent reason within the tripartite soul, is the unitary, incorporeal, simple component which comes from the realm of the gods and was brought down to earth, right? So it makes sense that in order to maintain this unitary nature, in order to have the simplest possible representation of reason, there must not be a bifurcation along the lines of gender. Essentially, how can we have the guardian class be the representation of this unitary reason within our souls when it's divided in half between male and female? It's just not possible. So that's, the real reasoning behind this. We have all these arguments about men and women, right? But really we're talking about within the soul, and we're just kind of fine-tuning the allegorical city in order to match up with our division of the soul better. We now move on to the next wave, where Socrates continues his homogenizing mission. We call back to Plato's passing comment, which is even more difficult and strange than the last one, that among the guardians there will be no family units, but instead the wives and children will be held in common among all members of the class. He says that matchmaking will be done based on the virtue of individual guardians, and the children will never know their real parents, nor will their parents know them. All guardians will be seen as the parents of all children, and all children as the children of all parents. Essentially one giant family where nobody knows the exact relation of each to the other. So it's a pretty strange and shocking proposal that Socrates is putting out here. It's pretty out there even to us, right? In order for us to discuss it, let's break it down into 3 layers here, because there's 3 real discussions going on. Firstly, we have the surface layer, which is making prescriptions about the specific nature of reproduction among the guardians. Then we have the deeper layer, the proposition and the reasoning behind these strange mandates, which is what Socrates calls the elimination of mine, which is really the elimination of individuality itself among the guardians. Finally, we have the consequences of this, the fundamental unity of the guardian class as one singular organism instead of a collection of individuals, then the consequences of this for our construction of the soul. So first, let's quickly run through the concrete proposals which Plato offers here. He says that marriage must remain a sacred thing, but it must be controlled and regulated by a ruling body which makes sure to matchmake couples in order to produce the best possible offspring. He says that in the same way that Glaucon breeds dogs selectively for their pedigree, so too must the guardians be bred in order to produce the best rulers. And obviously today, that idea is frowned upon. We would call that eugenics, right? But in my opinion, Plato is prescribing this here not necessarily as saying, this is what needs to be done, a selective eugenic breeding, right? Obviously, he's only saying it for the guardian class, first of all, but even among the guardian class, his reason isn't necessarily to produce like the, pure master race of guardians, right? His reasoning is, of course, as it always is, to reduce complexity among the class. And we see that with the second part of this proposal, where he says, next, the offspring that come of such unions must be spirited away at birth to be raised completely by wet nurses, the mothers only going to the separated children's house to breastfeed the babies. So now we see the reason that he wants reproduction to be done in this way is not only to produce better guardians, like he says, but it's so that parents have no incentive to have a relationship with their child, which it's going to be impossible for them to because they're going to be taken away directly at birth, right? Um, so it becomes more a thing about preventing the formation of family units among the guardians as opposed to eugenic breeding for any other type of purpose. So these two things combined, the arranged marriages and the taking away of children from their parents, will result in a class where nobody knows who their children are and none of the children know who their real parents are. Thus, all the children will treat all the adults of the guardian class as their parents, and all adults of the guardian class will treat all the children as their own children. So that leads us into the reasoning behind this pronouncement, and that is the complete and total elimination of individuality among the guardian class. That's a big source of individuality for a lot of people, right? This is my child. This is my wife. This is my husband, right? It's a statement of who you are, and it's kind of drawing a line in the sand around what is yours and what could be somebody else's, right? So in order for the guardian class to be unitary in the way that it must be for Plato, this has to be gotten rid of straight away. This can't be a thing at all. He talks about how there must be no distinction, not in economic position, not in hierarchy, and of course not in family. All the guardians must live in a common manner of ascetic existence, as we discussed before. Of course, no distinction due to individual ownership of women, children, or of men. It doesn't really matter. It's just the principle of you can't have any kind of distinction in this way. The guardians must do this because they have to have common wants and common minds. None must want for what the other has, nor possess what the other guardians may want. There must be complete fundamental unity. So, once we eliminate the gender divide, as well as the divides among families, as well as divides among economic position, etc., the guardian class doesn't really constitute a collection of individuals anymore. It is more a single organism which undulates along in sync with each other. They seek the same things, they execute the same tasks, they do everything in common. And what Plato has done here is essentially flatten a eukaryotic multicellular organism, a collection of individuals, into a single-celled prokaryote, right? That's really what he's done. He's made them into a single entity with one vision, one frame of mind, functioning as a single thing, okay? And that's the real reasoning behind both of the first two waves. We can talk about feminist proposals, we can talk about eugenic breeding, we can talk about all these things which on the surface are pretty interesting and still are pretty interesting, right? But people spend a lot of time thinking about the specifics of these proposals when in reality all they are is attempting to match up the guardian class to unitary reason in the soul. That's really all they are. It can be fun to look into them deeper than that, which we just spent probably 15 minutes doing, right? But that's really all it is. He's just trying to fashion a collection of individuals into unitary reason, and he's showing us how that could be done to the guardian class in the hypothetical city. So we understand now how the guardian class is going to operate. We understand how the rest of the city is supposed to operate from the last 4 books. The final question, which remains to be asked, is how can this city come into existence in reality? What would have to happen in order for the Callipolis to actually come into being? And that is obviously the ultimate question of the whole thing, because you can lay out this city all you want, and it remains just fanciful, right? And a lot of parts of it seem pretty crazy, right? So that really is the most important question, and that is what constitutes the final wave here. So we have the third interjection here asking how the city can come into being. And according to Plato, this is the most difficult to surmount. It is the question of the actual feasibility of the Kallipolis. How could it be brought into reality on Earth today? Socrates' answer to this question is quite simple. He says, in order to bring the city into existence, philosophers would have to become kings, or kings would have to become philosophers. Now, it seems like a fairly simple statement, but as we dive into it, we'll see that this is by far the most radical proposal and also the most dangerous proposal which Socrates offers. He's essentially saying that politics and philosophy must become one and the same. The practice of either must be the practice of both. Only at this point can the city be realized. It's a seriously dangerous assertion, especially for a time period where, unlike today, simply criticizing rulers could get your head on a pike. And that is what ended up happening to Socrates in the end. He was killed by Athens for what he was saying. Not necessarily for what he's saying exactly right here, but in general, what he was saying. So it's a dangerous thing to say, and his rationale for it is that only the philosopher is a lover of wisdom, while all others are lovers of only belief. Thus, only the philosopher could bring the ideal city into existence. So, what exactly is meant by this? Plato begins explaining the distinction between the lover of wisdom and the lover of belief by laying out a tripartite division of knowledge. On the one hand, you have knowledge, and on the other hand, you have the absence of knowledge. Knowledge grasps the fundamental principle behind a thing, while absence of knowledge grasps nothing, right? There's nothing there. I'm sure you see it, but it bears repeating that when Plato says knowledge can grasp the underlying concept or principle of a thing, he's talking about reaching into the realm of forms itself. We should quickly restate that the realm of forms is the incorporeal realm which houses the fundamental principles behind everything in existence. It is, depending on how seriously you take Platonism as a religious school, either a simple literary device used to describe abstract first principles, or it's a real place beyond physical existence which houses the fundamental entities from which all of reality emanates as their procession. So, what we're talking about here with knowledge is really the ability for someone to reach into the realm of forms and apprehend universal principles, something which only the philosopher who purifies his incorporeal soul and breaks its chains to the earthly body can do, as only that which is incorporeal can interact with that which is incorporeal. The body cannot access the realm of forms. In any event, we have knowledge and we have lack of knowledge. But there must be some kind of space in the middle, because most people wouldn't fall into either of these two categories. That middle ground is known as belief, the ability to understand the objects which proceed from the forms, but being unable to comprehend or even reach the forms themselves. Proglus puts it nicely when he describes it as the apprehension of the particular versus the apprehension of the universal. The universal, of course, being the forms, the particular being the procession out of the forms. He also describes it as the lovers of sights and sounds, the particulars, versus the lovers of wisdom, the universal. Lovers of opinion, particulars, versus the lovers of knowledge, the universal. This is the fundamental divide which Plato asserts, and we can now see that it's really quite a radical thing to say. It's essentially a declaration that everybody who is not a Platonist, who is not able to access the realm of forms through Platonic philosophy, is entirely unfit to rule and is living in ignorance. It's a declaration that Platonists have almost broken through our own reality and accessed an incorporeal realm which gives them the right to rule the rest of the incomplete, hopelessly befuddled masses, right? It may be a slightly hyperbolic way of putting it, but if we follow the implications of Socrates' statements on the topic, it's certainly valid. It's what logically follows. So, while at the beginning of this wave you may have thought, and I thought too, why is this the final wave? This seems fairly obvious and something I already assumed that Plato would say, right? It sounds like something he would say. Now we see just how radical of a statement it is, and just how dangerous too. This was a time when tyrannies, revolts, and political violence in general were much easier to come by. There was real danger to saying something like this for Plato, and in many ways trying to disrupt the present order in favor for what was at the time essentially a cult of zealous Platonists, right? It's almost really like a cult coming in and saying, hey, you're unfit to rule. We can access the realm of forms. We should be the ones in charge. It's a pretty crazy thing to say. And the Platonists certainly were zealous, right? Fast forward a few centuries, and their school of thought had conquered pagan Greece. Then it seriously influenced Christianity to the point where many of the early Christian thinkers were Platonists as well. And through Christianity, it influenced Europe as a whole. It really only began to decline with the Enlightenment almost 2 millennia later. So, you know, this radical proposal that philosophers become kings, flowing out from that, we can see just how zealous, almost cult like, the followers of Plato were at the time. I think it's really interesting. And again, it lends credence to what I have said in a lot of videos, that Platonism is looked at as this kind of dry philosophical movement when really it was more of a zealous religious movement, in my personal opinion. In any case, while this discussion is already on the incorporeal as we're talking about the realm of forms, let's even bring it a little higher and let's talk about it in the context of the soul. So the best way to think about the philosopher versus the common man is as the one who seeks to understand the particular manifestation of a thing, and the philosopher who wishes to understand the universal behind the thing. The lover of sights and sounds reasons without cause, only focusing on the visible object, while the philosopher trains his eyes on the cause behind the object, the place that it proceeds from. As usual, this relates back to our discussion on the all-important principles of precession and reversion along the ladder of existence to the original point of emanation from which all things proceed. The philosopher is the only one who understands this ladder of precession down from the incorporeal, down from the one. And so he's the only one who can unite the philosophical and the political. The only one who can raise the political, raise the city up to that level and allow for the birth of the ideal city. Essentially, what he's doing is raising the city up from something that is earthly to something that is incorporeal. And, we've been talking about, and obviously the whole point is that the city is supposed to represent the soul, right? Something that is incorporeal. So, by perfecting the city, by building this perfect city and making it into what Socrates lays out here, the philosopher king who did so would also be perfecting his own soul in the process. So, building off of this idea that the perfection of the Callipolis by the philosopher king would constitute the perfection of his own soul, let me break from Proclus here and actually offer some of my own thoughts on this section. Something that I haven't really done on this channel before, but this section and the arguments here about the philosopher king really got me thinking, and I saw some parallels that I think might be of interest to you guys. So, the building of the Callipolis itself in this way would be similar to the alchemical magnum opus, in which practitioners seek to transmute metal in order to engage on a deeper level with their own soul and transmute that through spiritual alchemy, right? So you have the alchemists who are trying to turn lead into gold, right? But in reality, they're doing that as a path toward the transmutation of their own soul through spiritual alchemy. So, in a lot of ways, I think that we can make the same connection here between the philosopher king building the Callipolis and a kind of spiritual ascent that he would be embarking on through the process. A building of the Callipolis would be no less momentous of an achievement as turning lead into gold, and it would be of the same variety in a lot of ways. It should be impossible in the realm of Genesis on Earth to do either of these things, as conditions don't allow for the fully ordered, perfect soul to come about. So it can only be achieved through the philosopher king or the alchemist tapping into the incorporeal in order to complete this task. Why do alchemists go through the trouble of trying to transmute lead into gold if it's really all about their soul in the first place? Well, by raising up the earthly art of metallurgy and uniting it with the heavenly art of philosophy/theurgy in this case, the alchemist is able to utilize this hybrid discipline, which gets its earthliness from metallurgy and its heavenliness from philosophy or theurgy, to in a sense link the two realms together, right? Thus, he's able to use the dual practice to tap into that, which usually would be beyond the physical, impossible to access, and he can complete a fundamentally impossible incorporeal task while within the realm of corporeality. That's the goal of it, right? Uh, a man cannot directly fly up to the realm of forms, but through uniting the earthly with the heavenly, he can make a connection which maybe could allow for the transmutation of his soul in this way. This same concept is, in my opinion, exactly what Plato is doing in the Republic, except that instead of metallurgy, he is using politics. He takes the earthly discipline of politics, unites it with the heavenly discipline of philosophy, and through the study of this dual-natured philosophipolitics, he is laying out a possible path towards transmutation of the soul, or to put it in more Platonic language, the purification of the unitary soul and its separation from the complex body so that it can return to the incorporeal realm. If the Philosopher King were to utilize the philosophical working which Plato lays out in the Republic, construct the Callipolis, and actually succeed at it, it again would constitute the perfection of his own soul. To me, this is what the final wave means and what it would mean for philosophers to be kings. Not just the unity of the two fields in a practical sense, but in a higher sense as well in order to perfect the soul, to develop fully justice in the soul. And, to me, that's what it means, the Philosopher King. It's not simply a wise man, putting down orders down to the masses. It's not about building a perfect city for the benefit of the inhabitants or whatever, right? What it's really about is the combination of philosophy and politics and the use of politics as a representative on earth of what is going on in the soul, right? Which is what we've been talking about, obviously. And that philosopher king would be committed fully to realizing the perfected soul both in the city and then in himself. It's more of a kind of personal ascending path than anything that has to do with, you know, earthly politics or even just the study of philosophy. It's an entirely different thing, this dual natured discipline. And I think it's really interesting to think about. And the implications of that for everything that we've talked about up until now are pretty interesting as well. Um, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about that. Maybe it's interesting to you, that perspective. I'm not entirely sure. In any event, I hope that this video has been interesting for everyone who stuck around. We got into some really interesting stuff, especially on the last wave. And I gotta say, I think I enjoyed going over Book 5 and especially writing the script for it most out of every book of the Republic so far. I had my doubts about it going into it because I was like, I don't really care about the particulars of the Guardian class. I just want to think about the more incorporeal metaphysical side of it more. But how wrong I was, right? This ended up being really the most metaphysically dense section that we've covered thus far. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Part 7 will be out in 2 weeks, of course. I'm going to try to be staying on schedule better. Hopefully this one comes out on schedule. It should. I just got to stay up tonight and edit, I guess. Make sure it comes out in the morning. But yeah, part 7 will be out in a couple weeks. We'll be over book 6, which is another fascinating one. It talks a bit more about the Philosopher King and then transitions in to maybe my favorite section so far, which is on the form of the good. And we're going to be talking about the realm of forms more obviously, which is a great subject. I love the realm of forms. I hope you guys love the realm of forms too. And, starting with this book, we really are getting into the serious, dense metaphysical sections of the Republic. And it only gets better from here. So I'm extremely excited, especially for the next part, but even going forward, I think it's just going to keep getting more and more interesting. Please let me know what you guys thought about this video. Let me know especially what you thought about kind of my thoughts that I offered, the kind of Hermetic Aside. Finally, maybe the name of my channel makes a little sense, right? Plato channel, but it's called Hermetic Perspective. So maybe that makes a little sense now. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.